May 10, 1941, Scotland, near Eaglesham. Rudolf Hess drops out of the night in a parachute, lands hard in a farmer's field, and stands up like a man who believes history is still listening to him. He is not supposed to be here. Hess is not a downed pilot or a lost navigator. He is Adolf Hitler's deputy Führer, one of the most recognizable names in Nazi Germany, a man who has spent years orbiting power so closely that he mistakes proximity for control. Yet now he is alone in the dark, limping through wet grass, his flight suit heavy, his mind locked on a single idea. If he can reach the right people in Britain, he can make peace. Not peace in the way ordinary people mean it, not the kind that ends suffering, the kind that frees Germany's hands. Hess has convinced himself that Britain can be separated from the war, that the British elite, aristocrats, old families, men who still believe diplomacy is a private club, will see reason and sign an agreement. Germany would dominate Europe. Britain would keep its empire. The war would become a different war, focused elsewhere. In his mind, it's not madness, it's strategy. But reality doesn't care what a man believes when he's fallen out of the sky without permission. Hours earlier, Hess had taken off in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, modified for range, flying north over the North Sea, cutting through black air and cloud. He flew without escort, without a public plan, and, crucially, without Hitler's blessing. That detail becomes the first layer of the mystery that will cling to him for decades. Was Hess acting alone, or was he a secret messenger sent by Hitler himself? In the moment, nobody can prove either answer, but the implications are enormous, which means rumors will take root immediately. When Hess is found, he gives his name in pieces, as if the name itself is dangerous to say out loud. Then he asks for a specific man, the Duke of Hamilton. He insists he has a message. He insists he must speak to someone important. The British treat him at first with a cautious disbelief. An enemy leader has parachuted into Scotland claiming he can end the war. It sounds like a trick or a breakdown. Either way, he is valuable. If not as a negotiator, then as a prisoner who might reveal something about Nazi leadership. But Hess doesn't behave like a man who understands his position. He speaks with an odd certainty, sometimes calm, sometimes rigid, his mind running ahead of the room. He seems convinced his mission will be taken seriously, that the British will usher him into a private meeting, and history will bend around his courage. Instead, he is detained. And as the days pass, it becomes clear that the British government is not interested in the kind of peace Hess is offering, especially not one that would leave Nazi Germany in control of Europe. His proposal reads less like diplomacy and more like a demand. So the man who imagined himself as a peacemaker becomes something else, an embarrassment to Berlin and a curiosity to London. In Germany, Hitler reacts with public outrage. The Nazi press declares Hess insane, unbalanced, acting without authorization. The regime strips him of his titles. The official narrative is sharpened into a weapon. Hess is a lone madman whose flight means nothing. But that narrative is too convenient. It fits too neatly. And when stories fit too neatly, people assume the seams are hiding something. The war continues without pause. Hess remains in British custody through the long years of conflict, guarded, interrogated, studied. The Nazis try to erase him. The Allies try to understand him. He becomes a living question mark, one that cannot be executed without turning him into a martyr, and cannot be freed without triggering outrage. Then the war ends. The world turns toward judgment. The Nuremberg trials begin in 1945 as a public effort to document, prosecute, and define the crimes of the Third Reich. Hess is brought to the dock with other surviving leaders, men whose names are already soaked in blood, whose decisions reshaped continents. In the courtroom, Hess becomes a spectacle again, but not for the reason he imagined in 1941. He claims memory loss. At times he sits silent, detached. At times he appears alert, even theatrical. Observers argue about whether the memory loss is real, exaggerated, or strategic. Psychiatrists examine him. Journalists write about him as if he were a character in a strange play, an architect of a brutal regime now pretending he cannot remember his own blueprint. And still the central mystery remains untouched. Why did he fly? Was it desperation, delusion, a private initiative, or a mission he later denied to protect Hitler, or to protect a secret he thought might still matter? At Nuremberg, Hess is ultimately convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy, and sentenced to life imprisonment. It is a punishment designed to be permanent, but not final, a sentence that keeps him alive as a symbol of Nazi leadership, without allowing him any exit. In 1947, he is sent to Spandau Prison in Berlin. Spandau is not a normal prison. It is a political artifact, administered by the four Allied powers, meant to hold high-profile war criminals under strict control. It is heavy with rules, rituals, inspections, and the constant awareness that the world is watching it like a sealed jar. Hess enters that jar and does not leave it for 4 decades. At first, he is one prisoner among others. Men convicted at Nuremberg, serving long sentences under an unblinking international arrangement. The prison runs on schedules and control. Food, exercise, lights, mail, visits. Everything measured, everything regulated. The prison itself becomes a symbol of post-war order, the victors controlling the remnants of the regime they defeated. But the years do what they always do. Other prisoners are released early for health, for politics, for shifting priorities. One by one, Spandau empties. The outside world changes. Berlin splits. The Cold War hardens. Walls rise. Ideologies glare at each other across streets. Inside Spandau, Hess remains. And as he remains, the prison's meaning changes. It stops being a place for multiple war criminals and starts becoming something stranger, a prison maintained for one man, like a monument built out of concrete and routine. That oddity, one man in an entire prison, guarded by rotating Allied powers, becomes the perfect breeding ground for conspiracy. Because when something looks excessive, people assume it's hiding something. And then the rumor appears, quietly at first. What if the man in Spandau isn't Rudolf Hess at all? The idea sounds ridiculous, but it survives because it has oxygen. Hess's strange behavior, his claims of amnesia, the secrecy around his health, the fact that so few people see him up close for long periods. In a world trained by wartime deception, the concept of a body double doesn't feel impossible. It feels plausible. And in the decades ahead, that rumor will grow teeth. Because if Hess isn't Hess, then the 1941 flight becomes even darker. A real Hess, vanishing into shadow while an imposter serves the sentence. The world outside forgets most prisoners, but Spandau's prisoner becomes a legend, part man, part myth, locked behind walls that outlast governments. And the longer he stays there, the more people begin to wonder whether the prison is holding a criminal or protecting a secret. September 30th, 1966. Spandau Prison, West Berlin. The gates close behind the last 2 released inmates, and Rudolf Hess becomes the only prisoner in a fortress still run by 4 victorious powers. Spandau was built to hold war criminals, but by the mid-1960s it had become something stranger, a Cold War relic that refused to die. The prison sat in West Berlin, an island of the West surrounded by the East, and yet Spandau itself belonged to no single side. It was operated under 4-power authority, with the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union rotating control, month by month, like a ritual meant to prove the old wartime alliance still existed on paper, even as it collapsed everywhere else. In theory, it was just administration. In practice, it made Spandau a living symbol, a single building where the Cold War had to cooperate, because not cooperating would mean rewriting the end of World War II. When the 7 Nuremberg prisoners arrived in July 1947, Spandau was a harsh place. Strict rules, tight schedules, minimal contact, surveillance that never blinked. Hess was always the most difficult inmate, the most suspicious, the most convinced that the world was plotting around him. Guards and directors argued over whether his illnesses were real or exaggerated, whether his groans were pain or performance. But as years passed, the prison emptied. One by one, the others left, released after serving their terms or freed. Early for health. Then came the day that changed the entire story. September 30th, 1966. The last 2 non-Hess prisoners completed their sentences and walked out. Hess stayed. From that moment until his death in 1987, Spandau became a massive institution maintained for a single aging man. The world outside would later describe it as absurd, an entire prison for one prisoner. But in Berlin, absurdity was normal. Walls divided streets. Tanks stared across checkpoints. And inside Spandau, the victors of 1945 still guarded one of the last living symbols of Hitler's inner circle. This is where the rumor found fertile ground. Because if you're a conspiracy theorist, you don't need proof. You need a setting. And Spandau was the perfect setting. Restricted access, political sensitivity, an elderly inmate with strange behavior, and an arrangement where the Soviets consistently opposed leniency, while the Western powers complained the rules were too strict. People asked the same question in different disguises. Why keep him? Hess had been sentenced to life at Nuremberg, yes, but other life prisoners were released on medical grounds. Why not him? Why keep a 90-year-old man behind walls guarded by rotating superpowers? There were obvious answers. Symbolism, politics, the fear of turning him into a rallying point. But obvious answers never satisfy the kind of mind that wants the world to contain secret gears. So the whisper turned into a theory. The man in Spandau isn't Rudolf Hess. It started as a fringe idea, mentioned in books, repeated in interviews, passed around as a what-if among people obsessed with the mystery of Hess's 1941 flight to Scotland. Hess had acted strangely at Nuremberg, claiming memory loss, sometimes speaking like a man in a fog, other times sharp and theatrical. If you already believed his Scotland flight was a secret mission, it wasn't a huge leap to believe the real Hess had been swapped out afterward to hide what he knew. And Spandau itself made the theory feel plausible. Few people saw Hess closely. Fewer still had a reason to challenge the official identity of prisoner number 7. The prison restricted letters, restricted visits, restricted everything. Inside, Hess's life became a loop, a small garden, a short walk, a rigid schedule, the same walls, the same routines, the same guards, and above all, the same loneliness. He was watched constantly, so constantly that lights were flashed into cells during the night as part of suicide watch procedures. Even his most ordinary moments had an audience. Even his aging was supervised. Over time, some restrictions eased, partly because there was no longer any prisoner society to manage, only one man, and the risk of him collapsing into complete mental ruin. Accounts describe how his conditions were loosened, more access to the prison space, more comforts, sometimes even small escorted trips outside the walls, during rare periods of relaxed enforcement. But the essential reality didn't change. He was alone, and the prison existed because the powers of the world could not agree on what else to do with him. In that environment, rumors breed like mold. People claimed his scars didn't match. People claimed his teeth were wrong. People claimed he didn't recognize old acquaintances the way the real Hess would have. They built narratives out of mismatched details, because in a vacuum, mismatched details feel like clues. The truth is, none of that was ever solid enough to stand on, but it didn't have to be. The rumor's purpose wasn't to be proven, it was to keep the story alive. Then, in August 1987, the story took its darkest turn. Hess was 93 years old. According to widely reported accounts at the time, he was left alone briefly in a small garden cottage. Minutes later, he was found slumped, an electrical cord around his neck. Officially, it was suicide. To most of the world, it was the end of a long sentence. To conspiracy believers, it was fuel. Because if he died without speaking, then whatever he knew died with him. And if he was murdered, then someone murdered him to keep secrets buried. Stories appeared insisting he had been silenced to protect high-level wartime negotiations, or to protect a truth about his flight to Scotland. The fact that Spandau was dismantled soon after, partly to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine, only added to the sense for some that evidence was being erased. But here's the difference between rumor and proof. Rumor expands in darkness. Proof needs something physical. And for decades, in the Hess case, the physical proof seemed impossible. Because Hess's body was not accessible for testing, and Spandau was gone. The doppelgänger theory survived partly because it couldn't be killed cleanly, until a small overlooked artifact re-entered the story. A blood sample taken during Hess's imprisonment from a medical check in the early 1980s had been preserved. Decades later, scientists could do what earlier generations couldn't: compare DNA from that preserved sample to DNA from a living male relative along the paternal line, and suddenly the myth was no longer protected by uncertainty. Because once you can test the claim directly, the story stops being about whispers in corridors and becomes about numbers, probability, and genetic matches. And that's where the Spandau legend finally meets its ending. One slide of old blood, one modern lab, and one answer the rumor cannot survive. West Berlin, late Cold War. The city is split by concrete and ideology, and in the middle of it sits an old prison that still runs on a World War II agreement. Inside that prison is one man, Spandau number 7, aging in isolation while 4 superpowers take turns holding the keys. And outside those walls, the same question keeps coming back like a bad echo. What if he isn't Rudolf Hess? The doppelganger rumor didn't start as a meme. It started as a serious whisper, serious enough that it spread through doctors, writers, and even high-level political circles. Decades after the war, people were still repeating the idea that the real Hess vanished and a substitute stood in his place. To understand why it lasted so long, you have to understand what Hess's life looked like to outsiders. They didn't see a normal prisoner. They saw an anomaly. Hess had arrived at Spandau in 1947 and remained there until his death in 1987, eventually becoming the sole inmate, a bizarre reality that made everything feel staged, excessive, secretive. The prison wasn't just a prison, it was a symbol, maintained, guarded, administered in rotation, like a Cold War ritual performed to prove the victors still controlled the past. And Hess himself didn't help. From the beginning, his story was already contaminated by mystery. In 1941, he had flown to Scotland alone, apparently hoping to negotiate peace, then spent years as a high-value prisoner. At Nuremberg, he claimed amnesia, then later admitted it had been a ruse. So when he became reclusive and unpredictable in prison, people didn't see mental decline or manipulation. They saw proof that something was wrong. Here's what conspiracy believers latched onto: his Scotland flight. If you already suspect there were secret negotiations, you're primed to believe he carried knowledge too dangerous to survive. His amnesia and strange behavior. If he could fake memory loss once, what else could be faked, identity included? Restricted family contact. The DNA study authors themselves noted that even before Hess reached Spandau, rumors existed, and they point to details like his claimed amnesia and refusal to see relatives until 1969 as factors that fueled suspicion. The only prisoner reality, maintaining an entire 4-power prison for one man, felt, to outsiders, like protection rather than punishment. Then the rumor got a boost that made it feel almost respectable. According to reporting on the 2019 study, Hess's Spandau doctor was among those who believed the imposter idea, and the same reporting notes that the belief reached high echelons, including claims that Franklin D. Roosevelt had doubts. In other words, this wasn't just late-night radio nonsense. The rumor survived because it attached itself to real oddities, and because nobody could decisively kill it. For a long time, there was no clean way to test it. Hess died in 1987 in Spandau, officially ruled a suicide by hanging with an electrical cord in a garden building, an event that spawned its own wave of suspicion. Afterward, his grave became a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site, so much so that in 2011 his remains were exhumed and cremated, and the grave marker removed, destroyed to prevent it being used that way. That should have ended any hope of DNA confirmation. Except, history has a weird habit of leaving behind tiny pieces of itself. In 1982, while Spandau Number 7 was still alive, a blood sample was taken during a routine medical check. Part of that blood ended up mounted on a microscope slide, labeled and hermetically sealed, kept for years for teaching purposes by one of the eventual study authors, former U.S. Army pathologist Rick Wall. Think about how absurdly fragile that is. A rumor the size of a Cold War legend resting on a smear of blood on glass. Decades later, when forensic genetics had advanced enough to do what earlier generations couldn't, scientists had two things they needed: DNA from Spandau Number 7, the slide sample, DNA from a living male line relative of Hess, for Y chromosome comparison along the paternal line. The team tracked down a distant male relative, kept anonymous in reporting, collected a comparison sample, and ran the analysis, focusing especially on the Y chromosome, which passes down the paternal line. And the result landed like a final stamp on the file. The analysis found the two samples were over 99.99% likely to be related, strongly indicating that Spandau Number 7 and the Hess male line matched, meaning the prisoner was Hess, not a substitute. That is what makes this ending so powerful for storytelling. It isn't a confession, a diary, or a declassified memo. It's biology. For decades, the doppelganger rumor survived because it lived in gaps. No public body, limited access, too many secrets, too much symbolism. But DNA doesn't care about symbolism. It doesn't care about legends. It answers one question only: who was he? And after nearly a lifetime inside Spandau, the answer finally came, not from a courtroom, not from a government archive, but from an old sealed slide that outlived the prison itself. Washington, D.C., decades after the war. Not in a bunker, not in a Soviet archive, not in a buried vault beneath Berlin. The final answer to the Hess doppelganger rumor is sitting on something almost laughably ordinary: a microscope slide, a preserved blood sample from Spandau Prisoner Number 7, taken in the early 1980s and kept sealed for years. For a long time, the rumor survived because it was protected by one thing: no definitive test. Hess died in Spandau on 17th August 1987, found in the prison garden, summer house, cottage, with an electrical cord around his neck, officially ruled a suicide. The British Royal Military Police Special Investigation Branch produced formal reports on the death in custody. And soon after, Spandau Prison itself was demolished, partly to prevent it becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Then, even the grave became part of the story. In 2011, Hess's remains were exhumed and cremated, and the grave marker removed to stop neo-Nazi pilgrimages. So if you were a believer in the imposter theory, you could always say the same thing. Prove it. And for years nobody could, because the most obvious source of proof, remains, was inaccessible. But the bloodslide changed everything. The unlikely evidence researchers later reported that the only known surviving DNA sample from Spandau No. 7 existed because a blood sample from a routine medical check had been preserved and sealed, making it usable for forensic DNA work years later. That's the cinematic twist. A rumor built on decades of Cold War fog gets cornered by a piece of glass that simply lasted. Once scientists had that sample, they still needed the other half of the puzzle. DNA from a living male line relative of Rudolf Hess, so they could compare inherited markers, especially on the Y chromosome, that track down the paternal line. And then the story stops being maybe and becomes math. The test that ended it in 2019, a forensic genetics paper reported a DNA comparison between the preserved sample from prisoner Spandau No. 7 and a living male relative from the Hess family line, finding a match consistent with Hess and refuting the imposter theory. Media coverage of the study summarized the result as effectively closing the case, with the researchers explaining that a non-match would have supported the imposter claim, but they got a match. That's it. That's the end of the doppelganger rumor. Not with a confession, not with a released MI6 file, not with a dramatic courtroom revelation, but with a genetic comparison that doesn't care about legend. Why the rumor lasted anyway. The uncomfortable truth is, the rumor wasn't born because people were stupid. It was born because the setting was perfect. A man who made one of WWII's strangest moves, flying solo to Britain in 1941, then spent the rest of his life locked away. A prison jointly run by the four Allied powers, rotating control even during the Cold War. A prisoner who became the only inmate from 1966 to 1987, turning Spandau into a massive, expensive monument built around one aging Nazi. That's the kind of environment where conspiracy theories don't just appear, they thrive. And after his death, when people questioned whether he could even have killed himself, the British RMP investigations and later public controversy only added more oxygen to the fire. So, if your episode is titled around a blood sample ended the doppelganger rumor, the honest ending is this. The man in Spandau was Rudolf Hess. The DNA evidence strongly supports that conclusion, and the imposter story collapses under modern forensic testing. But the bigger mystery still hangs in the air like smoke over Berlin. Not, was he real? He was. But why did he fly in 1941? And what did he truly believe would happen? That question is why Hess remains so haunting. A senior Nazi who tried to step out of a world war like it was a negotiation, then spent 40 years in a prison that outlived the alliance that built it.